region. We've done that in any number of ways. Special Envoy Feltman, as you know, has had an opportunity to travel to Ethiopia and the broader region several times in recent weeks. He just returned from Ethiopia over the weekend. He had productive meetings with the High Representative, President Obasanjo. He also met with senior Ethiopian government officials, African Union representatives, and international partners to discuss opportunities that advance a negotiated and sustainable cessation of hostilities to bring this conflict that has now raged for more than a year to a close. We have continued to call for an end to the fighting. We have continued to call for the parties to engage in diplomacy in furtherance of a cessation of hostilities, just as we have reiterated the calls of the international community for an end to the human rights abuses and violations that we've seen, as we have also urged the provision of humanitarian access to those in Tigray, to those in northern Ethiopia. The other point that we have been consistent in saying is that our embassy, as of early this month, is on ordered departure status. We've reduced the size of our footprint there, but our embassy is still very much open. Our USAID mission is still very much open and operating to support the people of Ethiopia, but in the case of our embassy, to support those with U.S. citizenship who may still be in Ethiopia. The point we have made is that Americans should depart the country immediately using commercial options which remain readily available. Over any given 72-hour period, there are dozens of commercial flights to international destinations within Africa, but also elsewhere, that Americans are able to avail themselves of. And we encourage them to do it because the security situation continues, of course, to be tenuous. Even as we have reduced the footprint of our embassy, we have actually increased the hours within our American Citizen Services section within the embassy to help Americans make those travel arrangements, to help place them on flights, and to facilitate the logistics involved in all of that. As we've made clear before, we will do everything from help them book a flight to pay for that flight with a repatriation loan should American citizens not be in a position to pay those upfront costs. Our commitment to the safety and security is a top priority for us, and that's why we are working literally overtime to do all we can to ensure that to see to it that Americans take advantage of the many options to depart the country via commercial air.
Sorry, can I quickly follow
Sure.
up? So did Special Envoy Feltman meet with any members of the TPLF?
We've been able to engage the TPLF, and we have engaged the TPLF, but I don't
he
have.
did not.
I don't have anything else for you on that. Yes, Ben.
What do you make of the disappearance of Chinese tennis player Peng Shuai? And do you have any concerns for U.S. athletes as they head over there to the Olympics? Do you think now is the time to call for a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics or any other sort of boycott?
Well, there have been a number of statements that have been made on Peng Shuai. I just saw a recent statement from the Women's Tennis Association. Of course, all of us, the State Department included, we are closely monitoring the situation surrounding Peng Shuai. We share the concern that has been expressed around the world, as we all want her, of course, to be safe. I'm not in a position to offer updates from here, but rest assured we are closely following her and the situation more broadly. As a general matter, as a broader matter, we'll continue to support the ability of individuals to report sexual assault and to seek accountability. And we believe that any report anywhere in the world should be investigated. We will continue in the PRC context and in all contexts to stand up for the freedom of speech, especially in light of what we've seen from the PRC, and that is essentially a zero-tolerance approach for criticism and a record of silencing or attempting to silence those who do attempt to speak out.
Should U.S. athletes be extra vigilant when they go to China for the Olympics? Are you going to issue any warnings for them? Do you feel that they are, if they criticize the government while they're out there, is that something you would advise them against doing?
Well, look, I don't have an update in terms of our approach to the Winter Olympics. There's still a number of months off, but when it comes to what our presence should be, there are a range of factors, including our deep concerns with the human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and we have talked about that both in the context of our bilateral relationship, but also specifically in this context as well. Our position on Xinjiang, our position on the PRC's continued human rights abuses is very clear. We have taken a number of steps to promote accountability for the ongoing human rights abuses, and in the case of Xinjiang genocide there, and we'll continue to do that. But I just don't have an update on the Olympics. Sure.
Just the IOC president said that he spoke with Ms. Peng. Does the United States have any assessment about whether is there any coercion involved, and do you have any general assessment of whether that was productive or not?
I don't have any assessment to share publicly. As I said before, we are closely monitoring the situation. We are closely following developments, but we'll leave it to the IOC, to the WTA, and others to speak to that. Yes?
I want to move to Iran.
Sure.
Iranian top nuclear negotiator in an interview with us in Al Jazeera, he said that U.S. must accept reality and lift sanction immediately, and that Iran is entitled to further advance its nuclear program, citing Article 26 and 36 of the Iran deal. Do you have a comment on that?
I don't have a specific comment to that, and that's precisely because the issue of sanctions and the issue of nuclear steps and nuclear restrictions, that's at the crux of what it is that the 6 rounds that have been concluded of indirect negotiations with Tehran and Vienna have been all about. It's also why we have very consistently called for the resumption of diplomacy, indirect diplomacy in the case of the United States, so that we can determine whether we can finalize the remaining issues. We can build upon the progress that had been achieved in those 6 rounds on the question of, on the one hand, the nuclear steps that Iran must take to resume its compliance with the JCPOA, and on the other hand, the steps regarding sanctions that the United States and the international community would be willing to take should Iran be willing to resume its compliance with the JCPOA. So we'll leave that to the negotiations in Vienna.
There is some reports in the New York Times that Biden administration is trying to give incentive to Iran by easing some sanctions to encourage them to negotiate faithfully in Vienna. Is this true?
We have been very clear all around that we are not willing and will not take unilateral steps as sweeteners to sweeten the pot just to get negotiations going. A mutual return to compliance, it is in the interests of the United States. It is in the interests of the other members of the P5+1. It is also, as previous governments in Iran have concluded, in the interests of Tehran if we are able to get there. So we will we will be clear that we're not going to engage in unilateral steps for the sake of just getting back to the table.
Also, the New York Times reported that U.S. officials have warned Israel that its attacks against the Iranian nuclear program are counterproductive and have enabled Tehran to rebuild an even more efficient enrichment system. Could you elaborate on this? I mean, have you been in touch with Israel on this issue and trying to persuade them not to attack?
Well, what I will say broadly is that we have been in regular, almost constant contact with our Israeli partners to include on this issue. Special Envoy Malley was just in Israel last week, I believe it was. He had an excellent visit there where he engaged in consultations with Israeli government counterparts and also with senior intelligence officials as we prepare to resume negotiations in Vienna. What he was doing there is not unique, however. We have regularly engaged with our Israeli partners before each round, in many cases during each round, and after each of the 6 rounds of negotiations that have been completed. Look, at the end of the day, the United States and Israel, we share a common objective here, and that is to see to it that Iran is verifiably and permanently prevented from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And we continue to believe that diplomacy, in coordination with our allies and partners, and that of course includes Israel, is the best path to achieve that goal. It's the best path because it sets us out on an approach that is verifiable and that is sustainable, and that is permanent. And that is one of the key advantages that the JCPOA conveys. So we will continue to consult very closely with our allies and partners. Special Envoy Malley in recent days alone has had discussions with his Chinese, his Russian counterpart as well. We have been in close contact with the E3. He had an engagement with the E3 members on his travel. He engaged with our GCC partners on the travel during that travel as well. And in all of those engagements, there was a broad and shared agreement that on the need for a mutual return to full compliance with the JCPOA.
So do you expect the talks to go on without a hitch next Monday, a week from today, on the 29th?
I certainly don't want to be in the business of predicting how this will unfold.
You don't see them being scuttled for any reason?
As of right now, talks are still slated to resume next Monday, November 29th.
At the IAEA Board of Governors meeting later this week, will the U.S. support a censure of Iran, given the steps it's taken outside of the nuclear deal?
Well, we have been very clear that Iran's provocative nuclear steps are of great concern to us. They are of great concern to our partners as well. We have made very clear that these continued nuclear escalations are unconstructive and they are at their core inconsistent with the stated goal, with Iran's stated goal of returning to mutual compliance with the JCPOA. We've also been very clear that they serve no constructive end. They will not provide Iran with any negotiating leverage when talks resume in Vienna next week. Look, we've noted with concern statements from Iran, statements to the effect of only countries with nuclear weapons have taken such steps with respect to enrichment. The JCPOA, one of, again, its core advantages, was the fact for us that it imposed strict limits, both on the level and the quantity of enrichment of enriched uranium in Iran. And Iran's continued escalations, its continued escalations beyond JCPOA limits, they're a clear reminder for us, for our partners as well, of the importance of seeing to it, or at least testing the proposition, that we can achieve a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA.
But they haven't faced any repercussions for the repeated steps that you've, again, criticized. At what point are you willing to censure them for what they have done and make them pay a price for it?
Well, we have been very clear for a number of reasons, including for these continued nuclear escalations, that this approach to the JCPOA, what we are trying to test out in Vienna, is not an approach that we will take indefinitely. It is not an approach that we can or should take indefinitely, because eventually Iran's continued nuclear advances will render the advantage, the utility of returning to the JCPOA as it was crafted and ultimately implemented in 2016 as not worth it. Not worth it for the United States, not worth it for our international partners as well. We're not at that point yet. We continue to believe that diplomacy provides the most sustainable, the most durable, and really the only permanent and verifiable means of seeing to it that Iran can never again obtain a nuclear weapon. And so that's why we are returning to Vienna to see to it if we can achieve that mutual return to compliance.
But short of that point, like, why not censure them now for the steps that they have already taken? As you said, for a program that otherwise would not need to take the steps, 60% enrichment, uranium metal enriched. Why not censure them?
Well, you referred to it. There is a Board of Governors meeting in the coming days. I don't want to get ahead of that meeting. We have full faith and confidence in the Director General, Mr. Amano. We have full faith and confidence in the IAEA itself. We've been consulting very closely with the IAEA. The Director General had an opportunity to meet with Secretary Blinken here at the department several weeks ago, but we have been in regular contact with the IAEA to determine the best approach and the best response to these continued nuclear escalations.
Americans detained in Iran separately from the negotiations over the JCPOA. Is that still the case going into this next round?
That's still the case, and it's still the case for one very simple reason. We have gone to Vienna to test the proposition as to whether we can achieve a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA. The very fact that we would like to see this happen, but we are not sure if it can happen, suggests to us very strongly that the fates of these detained Americans should not be tied to an uncertain proposition, and that's a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA. So even as we continue to see to it, continue to test whether we can affect a mutual return to compliance, we are working nonstop to see to it that these Americans can be reunited with their families, in some cases after years and years of separation.
Why not make it a precondition, though, for a return to the JCPOA?
Precisely because of what I said. The mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA is a very uncertain proposition. It is something that remains in our interest. We would like to see it happen precisely because it is in our interest, precisely because it is in the interest of our international partners in the context of the P5+1 and more broadly as well. But because it is uncertain, it would not be prudent to tie the fates of Americans to this issue. We feel that by working these issues on parallel tracks, separate but parallel tracks, we, in an ideal world, will be in a position to achieve both, a mutual return to compliance, even as we work over time to return these Americans to their families as soon as we can.
Can I quickly ask one more? Was there any discussion on the fates of these Americans while there was a hiatus on the JCPOA talks?
We are in regular contact with our partners. We are in regular contact on the issue of these American detainees. I'm not going to detail the form, the channel that takes, but again, we have no higher priority than the safety and security of Americans overseas, and of course, that includes Americans who are unjustly held, as is the case in Iran. Yes?
Thank you. The Secretary just returned from his first official visit to Sub-Saharan Africa. He was in Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal. He said really great things about those countries. Jollof rice in Nigeria, Teranga hospitality in Senegal. I was wondering if you can go back to that trip and give us the key agreements, achievements, and also in his discussion with President Kenyatta, Buhari, and Sall, what was the feedback like? Do they believe America is really back, diplomacy is really back? And was the Secretary given a new name and a traditional title in Nigeria? And I have one more.
Sure. So as you know, as you alluded to, the Secretary did return from his first travel to Sub-Saharan Africa. I suppose it was late Saturday night, early Sunday morning by the time we got back. And it really was a productive, a constructive, and excellent trip to all three countries. You had an opportunity to hear from the Secretary in each stop. In the context of his bilateral engagements, in the context of his civil society engagements, in the context of his press conferences with his counterparts, of the broad agenda that we share not only with these three African countries, but with many countries across the continent more broadly. And in each stop, you heard an emphasis on the challenges that if we are going to be in a position to solve, we have to work on together, including with the countries of Africa. And of course, on that list are issues like climate, issues like COVID. It is achieving a sustainable global economic recovery, including for these three countries and for the broader continent. Countries that in some cases, like many countries around the world, whose economic growth has been stunted by the onset of COVID-19. We also share any number of interests with these countries. Security interests, our economic ties in many cases are quite deep and have the potential to become even deeper. And in all three, we discussed the values that need to be at the core of these relationships, including human rights, democratic governance. These are three countries that, in a couple cases, will have elections within the next 2 or so years, and both have before been a model for the rest of the continent and beyond, and again, have the potential to be a model when it comes to democracy and democratic governance for the continent and well beyond. But this was a trip that was more than about just those three countries. We spoke to themes on this trip, again, climate change, COVID, shared security challenges, economic ties, that are broader than those three countries, and they're themes that are transcontinental in their nature, in that they apply equally to many countries across the continent. And in Abuja, the Secretary laid out in a speech an extended set of remarks that ECOWAS, an important regional institution, the approach we take to the continent, and that is one of partnership, of true partnership. And he explained at some length what that true partnership means. Final points on this. We often think of and talk about partnership in the bilateral context or in the regional context, government to government partnerships. But our relationships with these three countries, with many countries across Africa, transcend the official relationships, and there are people-to-people ties that are really at the heart of many of these relationships. And that is why this administration and previous administrations have invested so heavily in the human capital across Africa with programs like the Young African Leaders Initiative, or YALI. While he was in these countries, the Secretary had an opportunity to meet with several YALI alums to hear about their tremendous successes in using the skills, using the connections, taking advantage of the experiences that they had in YALI or other IVLP programs, taking those back to their home countries and really being leaders in their own right to help shape, to help craft the more secure, more prosperous future that the United States seeks to partner with these countries and with the continent at large to achieve. Yes, please follow.
Yeah, I have a second question. President Biden last week announced that he'll be hosting a U.S.-Africa summit next year. Can you tell us more about that? When, where, who will be invited, and who will be excluded? And you forgot to respond to the question on the traditional title.
I am actually not aware that a traditional name was bestowed, but if one was, I'll follow up with you on that. In terms of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, the Secretary announced this in his speech in Abuja. And what he said, what he spoke to was President Biden's intention next year to convene a summit with the leaders of our African partners. This is something that the Obama-Biden administration did in 2014, in August of 2014, as I recall. It was an opportunity to bring to Washington dozens of heads of state, heads of government, to deepen, at the time, our cooperation on the sets of issues that were most relevant then. We are now some 7 years, we will be perhaps closer to 8 years removed from that opportunity to bring to the United States many heads of state and government from Africa. So there are in some ways old challenges, traditional challenges that remain, but in many ways new challenges that confront us. And the Leaders Summit that the President intends to convene next year will be an opportunity to address those issues as well. I know it's something the Secretary looks forward to and the President as well.
Do we know when, where?
We haven't announced a date formally yet, but we will as it gets closer. Ben.
A new report came out last week that shows coronavirus samples from a cave in Laos had been taken to the Wuhan lab up till a few months before the virus broke out. Just wondered if it was still the administration's position that lab leak theory was very possible, and why it was dropping down the agenda. It wasn't mentioned in the ministerial. It wasn't mentioned between President Xi and President Biden. Has that just hit a dead end?
I would refer you to my White House colleagues, but I believe it was a topic of conversation between President Xi and President Biden. Not because, and Secretary Blinken has spoken to this. This is not an issue that is solely about accountability for what happened. This is about preparing the world, ensuring that the world is most prepared for, most resilient against a potential future pandemic. And this is something that the Secretary discussed on his recent travel to Africa as well. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when we have another pandemic. And so that is why we are so focused on understanding the origins of the coronavirus pandemic, because only by understanding what has happened in the past will we be able to best defend ourselves here in the United States, but knowing that these pathogens, these viruses, don't respect borders. We have to ensure that the world, too, is as best prepared as possible. And so that is why you saw a focus, including in Dakar, where the Secretary visited the Pasteur Institute, such a focus on not only COVID and recovering from COVID, but also building that resilience, building that global health security broadly in Africa, around the world, knowing that we are only as strong as the weakest link when it comes to this. As you know, the intelligence community has been looking at this issue very closely. They have now issued a couple public reports. I'd refer you to those public reports, public assessments for the current state of our analysis, but I can reassure you certainly that understanding the origins of this virus remains a priority for us so that we can best protect ourselves the next time around. Let me just move around to the, okay.
Very quickly, the Lebanese foreign minister met today in Moscow with his counterparts and so on, and he invited Russian companies to come to participate in rebuilding the port. Would that be fine with you? Would that, would you look favorably at Russian companies working in Lebanon, rebuilding the port?
Look, I would refer you to to Lebanese authorities for details of that overture. I can tell you from our perspective, we've been working very closely with our partners, with our counterparts in the Lebanese government. Our partners in this case being the French, being the Saudis, being a number of other countries, including countries in the Gulf, who have a shared interest in seeing to it that Lebanon is a country that enjoys more stability, more security, and more prosperity as well. We have been working, and the Secretary, had an opportunity to meet with Prime Minister Makati when we were in Europe late last month, I believe it was, where we discussed the issue of seeing to it that the Lebanese people are afforded humanitarian relief. They are afforded the opportunities that for far too long have been deprived from them in terms of safety, in terms of security, in terms of economic development and prosperity as well. Yes?